Good evening and welcome. Hello, hello, people, lovely people. Welcome to those who are online. Welcome to those in person. We are Café Théologique. If you've not been before, I'm sure most of you have, but if you haven't, Café Théologique happens about 6 times a year, twice an academic term. It's run by the University of Reading Chaplaincy. I'm Mark, I'm the Anglican chaplain. And really the whole idea is to take a theologian or someone thinking about theological topics and bring them into a public domain. We're in a bar. So rather than a sort of formal lecture, it's much more of a discussion. So I hope you enjoy this evening. So my guest tonight is Fiona Haworth. Now I'm going to introduce Fiona, and actually we're going to run this evening as an interview, sort of back and forth. Sometimes an interview works in just unpacking ideas, particularly as tonight, the kind of ideas might be a bit, how can you possibly do that? But hopefully this will be a really interesting, thought-provoking conversation. When we come to the Q&A section in about 45 minutes' time, Fiona's provided me with some questions. There will be exams. So we will mention the questions and we'll encourage you to talk to somebody near you about what you think about the answers, what responses you have. And then we'll have Q&A. So we'll end about 9 o'clock. So our guest this evening is Reverend Fiona Haworth, who's a former university chaplain. I'm going to get that in first. We're university chaplains for University of Worcester. Is presently the associate priest at St Peter Mancroft, a gorgeous church in Norwich, if you know it. If you don't, when you go to Norwich, have a look. It's very, very nice. And Fiona's doing a PhD through the Lambeth Degrees in Theology scheme, which I did my own PhD through, so a scheme close to my own heart. The topic that we're going to be discussing tonight is of God, dogs, and people. Thinking theologically about human-canine relationships. Can we welcome Fiona?
Thank you.
This is the strangest, probably the strangest interview I've done for Café Theo. And over the last 2 weeks, when I've spoken to people, they've either said, what? Or they've been, oh, I love dogs. There are people here who love dogs in the audience, just so you're aware. Just give us a little bit of background about yourself, if you wouldn't mind. Just tell us about yourself.
I'm an associate priest. I'm married to Martin. We have a son, Leonard. We have a border collie called Camus. And life is better with a dog. It's messier. We're at the molting stage at the moment, so there are little fur balls floating down the hall. It's also more complicated and more expensive, but it's just generally happier with a dog. So that's partly why I'm doing the research.
Okay. Now, your background is as a scientist, isn't it?
It is, yes. I did a degree in physiology and biochemistry at Reading a long time ago.
Where did you say?
At Reading.
Reading. Anybody heard of Reading? Good time? Good experience?
Yes, it was very good. Yeah, I enjoyed it.
After that, you went to Nottingham, didn't you?
I went to Nottingham to do a PhD in biochemistry, looking at perfluorochemical emulsions for use as blood supplements, because perfluorochemical emulsions carry very high levels of oxygen, dissolved gases generally. So a lot of the funding came from Jehovah's Witnesses groups in the United States for use to use the emulsions as blood supplements to enable people to have operations without having first to collect their own blood to be transfused back into them. But it was overtaken by biochemical advances.
Yes, when we spoke, we were chatting earlier. You put all this effort into it, but actually, it's not of value at all anymore.
No, I don't think so.
Tragic.
But yes, learning is good and valuable for its own sake.
Students who are here hear this. Don't worry about employment. Education is good for its own sake. You a little while after that, you ended up in Hong Kong doing something rather remarkable, didn't you?
Yes, I went to Hong Kong with an organisation called Open Doors with Brother Andrew. So I spent about 4 months taking Bibles into China.
Could you just tell us a little bit about what that was like?
it was quite hard work. They had an office based in Hong Kong, and we used to go from Hong Kong to various different entry points into China, taking Bibles and other theological materials, and sometimes money for the underground church, which we would take to various secure locations and leave. Usually we very seldom met any of the Chinese Christians because it was too dangerous for them to be seen associating with Westerners. So yes, it was kind of going through customs, and often we were stopped and goods were confiscated, but often we got them through. So
were you hiding Bibles, or would you be open about it? How much risk was there, I guess I'm asking?
There was no risk at all for us, really, because yeah, I think we were more objects of amusement to some of the customs officials who found Bibles on us. They were just kind of, what are these crazy people doing? And they would confiscate them. And because I was there for quite a long time, occasionally I would be given the task of going to collect them and turning up to collect them and take them back, so that we could try and get them back in at another time. So it was interesting.
What sort of religious background did you have?
I grew up, I'm an Anglican compromise. My mother was Roman Catholic, my father was agnostic. And when I was born, I'm the eldest child. My mother said, we've got to get her baptized. And my father said, well, you're not getting her baptized in the Roman Catholic Church. So the Anglican Church was a compromise.
In so many ways.
In so many ways, yes.
You began to sense a call, a vocation, I think. Can you say a little bit about that? Because I think it happened before the Anglican Church accepted women as
yes, it did. I kind of assumed, I went to Hong Kong with open doors after I submitted my PhD thesis, expecting to come back for my viva and to find some kind of work in scientific research. And it was when I was in Hong Kong that I felt a call to ministry within the Church of England. And it was at the stage when the debates were going on about whether or not to ordain women over here. But of course, in Hong Kong, there were already women priests. And I used to divide my time, really. There were a lot of links with Jackie Pullinger and the work she was doing with the Open Doors team, and a lot of them went to her community for worship, and I used to go with them. And at the same time, I found myself being called to the Anglican Cathedral. So I was exposed there to the ministry of women priests, and it was through that really that I had my call to ministry in the Church of England, which was a shock at the time. And it happened on a star ferry going across to Hong Kong Island. And I've got a very vivid memory of sitting on the deck of the ferry, reading the Bible readings that were set for cathedral worship, and thinking, no, this isn't part of my plan, really. But yes.
You trained at St John's, Nottingham.
Yeah.
I think you had a couple of years of sort of experience before that, testing, I think.
Yes, I worked for a year on a ministry experience scheme in the Diocese of Southall and Nottingham, as it is now. And then I did a year in a church plant in inner city Nottingham, part of the Anglican Church, but on a very deprived and geographically isolated estate in Nottingham, which was cut off on one side by the dual carriageway, on one side by the, no, on two sides by the dual carriageway. It was a triangle, and on one side by the railway. So it was a very, very poor, predominantly white working class area, which was just have no links with the parish church at all, really.
So there's a fairly standard pathway for people training for ordination. You go off to college, at least we did back then. Things have changed.
Yeah.
Standards have slipped. And then you had a curacy, sort of 3 years
Yeah.
apprentice vicaring. And then what?
I did my curacy, and then I went across from Sutherland, Nottingham to Kidderminster, and I was a team vicar for about 7 years, I think. And then I went to the University of Worcester as chaplain.
I think it was at Worcester, you actually started doing ministry with the dog. Is that right?
Right, yes. I used to arrange for a therapy dog to go into the university at particularly stressful times. So during exam times or assessments. And yeah, it was fascinating, the impact we had. But it was a spaniel called Monty, and Monty would come in and he would just sit in the student centre, and you'd see people doing a double take and just smile. So just seeing the dog in the student centre, for a lot of people, it made them smile. A lot of people drawn to it, and used to get staff asking me, when's Monty coming in again? I'll come and see him. And people would go out of their way.
Forget the chaplain, when's the dog coming?
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of students found it incredibly helpful. And we found that very often students would come and they would sit next to me on the sofas, but they would look at Monty and they would tell Monty what was troubling them. So they knew that I was overhearing, but it was a way of communicating, I think, with a dog who obviously just doesn't judge, just looks completely focused on the person. And that opened up an awful lot of conversations that wouldn't otherwise have happened, I think, were it not for having the therapy dog there.
Your current post, we will talk about dogs soon, don't worry. Part of the reason for doing this is just to show the pathway of a life. Sometimes when we have somebody on a sofa here and they're doing something that we find really interesting, it's like, wow, how do you get there? And I think telling a story is quite good before we will get to dogs, I promise, and theology. You're at St Peter Mancroft now as associate priest. You have a really interesting role there, don't you? Could you just say a little bit about that? I'm slightly envious, I have to say.
I'm the sidekick. We have a vicar who does all of the formal civic stuff. So he's the chaplain to the Theatre Royal, and he gets to do remembrance and all of the very formal civic things, a lot of networking. And if we have big funerals or memorial services for the great and the good, that's his role. So I get to do the interesting stuff around the edges. So I do some of the interfaith work. I work with the Jewish community on the Holocaust Memorial. I'm involved in a peace camp. I do some work with groups like Christian Climate Action and XR. And I get to lead some really interesting art projects. So in the run up to COP26 in Glasgow, we had Luke Jerram's Gaia, the large globe. So we had that for a month, and I put together a programme of events exploring the climate crisis. So we had lectures, art events. We had a busking and beer evening, which was great fun. So yes, I get to do sort of interesting bits and pieces.
How in what is in many ways quite a formal church has the XR stuff gone down, and your involvement with that part of society?
Not terribly well. They're a bit too controversial, I think, but yeah, and I think particularly when they were getting a lot of very bad publicity over the big actions that they took, particularly the preventing the distribution of newspapers. That was hugely problematic. They targeted the press that had been particularly peddling stories about climate change denial. And some members of the church read those newspapers and were most put out when they didn't get them on their Saturday morning. So questions were asked of the vicar.
So involvement with the arts, involvement with campaigning, interfaith stuff. You're a member of the Iona community as well. I don't know where that comes in your story, but clearly the social justice and the environmental stuff is probably quite linked up with Iona, isn't it?
It is. I've been a member of the community for about 10 years now. And I think I was drawn to it first through the worship because it seemed to be much more rooted and earthy than a lot of the formal worship in the Church of England. It's also quite wordy. We have a problem with words in the community. We use a lot of them. And we're a very argumentative community, which is great fun. But yes, I often think that it's the Iona community that helps me stay in the Church of England.
Right, here we go. We're gonna get into the theology now. Your theological entry into thinking about animals started with your masters, didn't it?
It did.
So you went down to Salisbury, Sarum College. What was the masters?
Theology, imagination and culture.
Just listen to that. Theology, imagination and culture.
It was fabulous.
What does that involve? For anybody out here thinking of doing a master's?
I can't recommend it highly enough. The whole thing's wonderful. We used to go for 2 modules a year, so it was an intensive week of study. So we looked at literature, poetry, film, art. We did some post-colonial study. We had some modules on AI and new technologies. So it was really broad-ranging and very creative, and it's had a huge impact on my ministry, I think, in terms of the thinking that I'm able to draw on in the theological study. So yes.
And it was your dissertation,
yes,
for this master's, part-time master's, I guess.
Yes, I was a chaplain at the time.
So what was the dissertation
then? My dissertation was really the forerunner of what I'm doing now. I was looking at the relationship between humans and dogs and trying to think about that theologically.
Let's start with the. I got rather geeky when we were talking about this. Let's do a bit of evolutionary history.
Yes.
Can you tell us about dogs in terms of the big history of the world, the planet? How did dogs come about? What's the link with wolves and?
Human beings, modern human beings, probably evolved around 100,000 years ago, and human culture, as far as we can determine from the archaeological record, was fairly static. There are isolated pockets of creative activity, but generally speaking, technology was very static. And then about 40,000 years ago, humans migrated into Europe, and an event happened which is known in some circles as the Paleolithic explosion. And we see this sudden huge diversification in stone tool making. So you get a huge variety of different types of tools, and they start moving into using bone and antler to create tools as well. And we start to get the first formal decorative work and some of the early carvings in caves which predate the Paleolithic cave paintings. And so there's a lot of thought about what actually triggered that Paleolithic explosion. And some recent research into dogs. Dogs were neglected for a long time in scientific study because they were thought to be kind of soft wolves. So domestication had ruined them, was the idea. And they were thought to be domesticated about 10,000 years ago, but gradually the dates are being pushed further and further back. And it looks as if dogs may have first evolved from wolves around 32,000 years ago. So it places them in this kind of cultural explosion. And I think there's some really interesting questions there about what role dogs, the evolution of dogs from wolves, may have played in human becoming, into human beings becoming the recognizably cultural and artistic beings that we would recognize today if we met them.
So this is among Homo sapiens, not Neanderthals.
No, Neanderthals were in Europe at the time, have been for an extended period, and were very well adapted to the very difficult, challenging climatic conditions. But as far as we can tell, they never had dogs.
Now, we tend to think of domestication as a rather one-way process, what humans do to these dogs, but I think you think of it, or others have thought of it, as a two-way process, haven't you?
Yeah, yes. Some of the scientists studying dogs have been particularly interested in how the relationship came about. And one of the ideas is that dogs may have domesticated themselves. It seems extremely unlikely that human beings would have set out to domesticate a much more powerful predator than they are. So something must have happened, and there's an evolutionary theory, niche construction theory. Standard evolutionary theory is about the gradual change of organisms in response to specific environmental changes, whereas niche construction theory allows a much greater role for the interaction between environments, creatures. So creatures can shape environments, and evolution comes about through that interaction. And some creatures create niches that they exploit. So one of the ideas is that wolves and human beings both found themselves following the reindeer herds that were in Europe at the time. Wolves and humans had very similar social structures. So wolves, you tend to get an alpha pair, the male and female. They have cubs, and often when the cubs grow older, they will help look after the next generation of cubs. So it's a sort of family structure. And occasionally the siblings of the alpha pair will also be involved in rearing the families. So there's a kind of recognizable social structure to wolf packs that is recognizable in terms of human family structure. So the idea is possibly that you have these groups following the great reindeer herds, and because they were thrown into quite close company with each other, that this niche was created in which both found that they benefited from the presence of the other.
So what does each get from the other?
Wolves and dogs have a much better sense of hearing, much better sense of smell. They're able to help with hunting. So recent research in hunter-gatherer societies has found that hunter-gatherer societies that hunt with dogs tend to be more successful than those without. And similarly, research into early human tribes who utilised dogs in reindeer herding found that they tended to be more successful. Dogs benefit from the scraps that we leave behind because we don't eat everything. Dogs don't. Dogs will eat pretty much everything. And yeah, dogs are really interesting as an animal in that they are socially better at reading human communicative cues than the great apes are. So lots of work has been done recently looking at dogs from a very young age, even young puppies, will follow human pointing gestures, will follow human gazes, and great apes don't do that. So there's that sense that dogs are particularly good at interpreting human actions, or are interested in the way in which human beings behave.
I think that's absolutely fascinating. And then culturally, we've got evidence, pretty ancient evidence, for humans valuing dogs in terms of burials, I think.
Yes, dog burials, I think, come a little bit later. So probably 16 to 14,000 years ago, we first start finding the first archaeological record of dogs being buried either with human beings or separately. But the fact that dogs were being buried at all suggests that they were of high value. There are some interesting examples from early humans in France, or modern humans in France, the Magdalenians, who kept small pet dogs, spaniel size probably. And from some of the archaeological remains we've found, it is clear that sometimes they ate dogs. I suppose if you have a dog and food is scarce, then they might have wanted to eat it, or felt that they had to. But from that same period, there is also archaeological evidence of a very elderly dog that had sustained injuries which had healed, that had been buried with great care. So there's this obviously complex relationship with dogs, but evidence that people did take great care of them. And there's another skeleton that was found in Israel that dates to about 12,000 years ago, in which it's a woman who is buried with her hand resting on the rib cage of a puppy. So, sorry, and the practice of burying dogs persisted for quite a long time into the early Christian period.
And what dogs did as they evolved was, I think their juvenile state, yes, lasted longer. That said, it was really a dog and a wolf, I think, isn't it, really?
It's one of them. It's the process called Neotony, in which the juvenile state is prolonged, and human beings have gone through this process as well. So the juvenile characteristics, the childhood equivalent, tends to last longer, and an interest in play and playful behaviours is retained much longer into adulthood than it is with creatures that don't go through this process. And it's been suggested that that's the difference between chimpanzees and bonobos, that bonobos, who tend to be less violent, have undergone a similar process, in that their juvenile period is extended longer and they remain more playful into adulthood longer.
I didn't ask you this when we talked earlier, but are there sort of, with the therapy dog, if I pat the therapy dog, are there chemical things going on for both parties when we do that?
Yes, there are. It's been done by saliva samples, experiments with people and dogs, and they found that when people pet dogs, serotonins are released, and the hormonal responses that are associated with parent-child bonding, and they're found in both dogs and human beings. So you would talk about that in terms of human beings, about this love relationship. People are obviously a lot more twitchy. Scientists are a lot more twitchy about using words like love about experimental subjects, but not interestingly when they're talking about their own dogs.
Do the dogs get anything out of it being stretched?
Yeah, they seem to enjoy it. They will seek people out, but they get the same chemical response if you take saliva samples from dogs. So the same chemical pathways are triggered, hormonal pathways.
Win-win.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just as a tangent, for those who who ponder about Darwinian theory. Darwinian theory is under quite a lot of thinking. Often we have this phrase, the survival of the fittest, but this sort of stuff suggests that actually it's rather more complex than that. It's not about competition always. It could be about cooperation.
Yes, yes, and you see that particularly in wolf packs where siblings of the alpha pair and older offspring will help to look after the younger generation. And also some evidence that some of the sometimes older wolves that are perhaps injured in some way will be cared for by the others. But in other species, we know that that's also the case. I think there's been some research done into elephants, and there was an elephant, I can't remember what the herd was, but one of the elephants was lame in some way. It was a permanent condition, and the other elephants used to wait for this elephant. They were always aware of where she was, and would wait for her to catch up. And even instances of the matriarch of the herd feeding the elephant. So there's these evidence of caring relationships across species, really.
Thank you. We'll move in a moment into the PhD on what you're doing currently. As a sort of segue to that, what have religions said about dogs? What roles have dogs played in the great belief systems of the world?
It's really interesting. We suspect that quite early on, dogs were seen to have, in some of the Middle Eastern religions, a role in negotiating death. I think because dogs are very good at, have better hearing and a sense of smell. They were often perceived as good guards, so they would warn people in advance if there was a threat. And so they were seen as occupying this kind of liminal space, a guarding space. And so a lot of the Eastern religion, Middle Eastern religions, dogs have a role in rituals around death. The Zoroastrian religion is one of them, in which dogs were thought to accompany people who died in their journey to the afterlife. And so in the funeral rituals, dogs would be taken to view the body as part of that process. I think there were less, it wasn't dogs so much in the Egyptian religions, but there was the jackal-headed dog, Anubis, who was also involved in the negotiation of the space between this life and the next, and in funerary rites. But pet dogs, we know the name of around 77 pet Egyptian dogs because they're recorded in the hieroglyphs on various people's tombs. So although they weren't necessarily involved in the religious practices of the Egyptians, they were certainly very well cared for.
Were they mummified with their owner?
Somewhere, yes, yeah. Mm.
Just making a suggestion there if you're planning your funeral ahead. So if anybody ever goes to Pompeii or Italy, I have a memory somewhere of seeing a mosaic on a threshold. Beware of the dog, and I guess the dog would have been on the threshold. And from that, then we developed these ideas of the threshold between life and death. Dogs don't get such a positive look in the Jewish Christian scriptures, do they?
No,
it's mixed.
It is very mixed. It's and it may have been a reaction to the surrounding religious cultures. So a very clear drawing of the boundaries on the part of the Jewish faith. There's one little story, the Exodus from Egypt. We're told that the dogs of Egypt were silent on the night of the Passover, so they allowed the Israelites and their flocks and herds to escape without alerting the Egyptians to the fact that they were leaving. So they were allowed from that to receive meat that the Israelites wouldn't be eating. So it was a kind of acknowledgement of their role in the Exodus.
But otherwise, a bit of an unclean,
Yeah.
and I think used as an insult as well, probably.
Yes, they were really. I mean, we know that there were certainly records of working dogs, and mostly it's matter of fact descriptions of dogs involved in shepherding or hunting. But yes, I mean, Jesus talks about
It's a very strange story about him, the
Canaanite.
the Canaanite woman, and she argues with him, even the puppies eat the scraps under the table.
Yes, yeah. And she uses the Greek word for the household pets at the time, which is an interesting use, that it's a pet dog rather than working dogs that she's thinking of.
Let's talk about the PhD. Before we get straight into the dogs, let's step back a bit. You're wanting, first of all, to conceive of a space in which animals have a role within the salvation, within the theological view. So often, when we in Christian theology, we tend to treat humans completely separately from everything else, don't we? And we don't think that animals or the material world has much of a look in. But you want to kind of step right back and start from the beginning. And you do that in particular by looking at a theologian called von Balthasar.
Yeah.
So we're just going to spend a little while unpacking that. So tell us who von Balthasar is, and tell us about how we can get from this weird named person to thinking about dogs.
Hans Urs von Balthasar was a Swiss theologian. He was originally a Jesuit, and very unusually, he left the Jesuits and was not very popular with the Roman Catholic Church for quite a long time, although he was being rehabilitated just before he died. And I think he was due to be made a cardinal.
We're talking mid-20th century, aren't we?
Yeah. So his real interest was German theatre and literature. And that's what he did his PhD in before he joined the Jesuits. And he was known as the most cultured man in Europe for a long time. And he encountered a woman who had intense spiritual experiences. And he left the Jesuits to help her form a lay community. And her mystical experiences influenced his theology.
So she was having visions, and he was interpreting and writing them down.
Yes. Yeah.
He has a particular helpful way of thinking about things that you want to look at.
Yeah. His main work is the theological ascetics, the Theodrama and the Theologic. So these series of volumes, there's 5 volumes in the Theodrama, which is the one I'm mainly focusing on. But it's his idea that the whole of history is a drama that is still being played out in the world, and that the key roles are filled by God. So God as director, Jesus as the principal actor, God as the author, and the Holy Spirit as the director. So there's that influence, but it's a very open theology. And I think in part it was a response to the very reductionist scientific method that had kind of slipped its way into theology over the years. So he created this very expansive theology in which there is room for the whole of human history to be incorporated in the drama of salvation. And so if he's sticking in the whole of history, animals are part of that history. I think for a long time, theology has been very human-centered and has seen human beings as distinct, whereas I think now, scientifically, we know that human beings are kind of the end of the continuum. rather than a very distinct, separate thing.
So we start up with von Balthasar taking this metaphor of using the theatre, which I guess rather than film, but probably theatre, I guess.
Yeah.
And the characters would be surrounding a theatre production and lifting that across and then using that to understand the relationship between God and humans, Holy Spirit as director, Godfather as author, Jesus as principal actor. And then there's a set, because in order to do a drama, it has to be set somewhere, and this is actually part of the stage, the setting.
Yeah.
So if we use this metaphor, it means that we don't think of humans separately, but we see humans as part of nature.
Yes.
Nature is the set in which salvation occurs.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
So the very first stage of your PhD is to say, let's look at change the whole way we think about theology, because if we just look at humans as souls, we'll end up in a very narrow space. But if we look at humans on a stage, the stage is important.
Yes, it is. I think von Balthasar is really interesting. I am convinced that he never had any kind of companion animal, because his own theology is really anthropocentric. And towards the end of the 5th volume of the Theodrama, you get 3 pages in which, almost in passing, he says, actually, those medieval views of the new heaven and new earth are really quite cruel. And it's cruel, the word he uses, because Aquinas particularly had a view of the life to come as mineral and human. So there was no place in it for any of the creatures. And von Balthasar says, yeah, it just seems a bit cruel, and it's certainly not in keeping with the biblical tradition. So you have the wonderful prophecies, particularly in Isaiah, about the lion lying down with the lamb. And he talks as well about the rich artistic visions of Revelation later on, the idea of Jesus, which is presented as the Lamb of God. So he said, you've got this really rich tradition, and the medieval theologians just didn't account for it at all. And if we're going to take the Bible seriously, then we need to make space for that. But then he doesn't do it. He just kind of leaves it as this, oh yes, I've noticed this, but now I'm going on to the next thing.
So he thinks it's wrong to talk about salvation as about souls of humans, because if people are made by their environment when they're on earth, won't that carry on after they've died?
Yes, I mean, von Balthasar was deeply influenced by the early church fathers, who had a much richer and fuller idea of the redemption of the heaven and the earth. So the idea in the Greek fathers that and we still say it in our creed, a new heaven and a new earth. It's the two. We believe in a physical resurrection, and to have a physical resurrection, we have to have a physical earth stage to be on. And so it's what is that filled with?
Right, so this opens the door now to, we can see where dogs would fit in as a wider part of, this is what it would mean to have an embodied existence in the future. There's a particular theologian, Maximus the Confessor, who's been quite important for you as well, isn't it?
Yes. Von Balthasar, I think, really recovered and did some of the translation work on Maximus the Confessor. He's a really interesting theologian who was instrumental in confirming the theological thought associated with the Nicene Creed. But his view was that all of creation bears the imprint of its creator. It's very careful not to be accused of pantheism. Creation is distinct from the creator, and von Balthasar takes this up. But the creator is present to creation because he is the giver of the gift. And the way in which Maximus talks about all created things bearing the imprint of their creator is a concept called logoi. So we have Jesus, the logos of God, And because the pre-incarnate word, the logos of God, was instrumental in the act of creation, all created things have a logoi. And he was influenced a little bit by Platonism. So there are categories of logoi. So there are logois of human beings, and there are logois of dogs and logois of cats. But then each individual within those categories also has a logoi. So there's a logoi of Camus the collie, and a logos of each individual human, logoi of each individual human, and that's how creatures bear the imprint of the maker.
So we got as far as the idea that Christians should think about humans as part of systems, and it's the whole system that's got involved, God is interested in, and that includes animals. I'm going to just do a pretty rapid fire, because in 5 minutes we're going to pause. So we're verging on the idea that salvation might include animals. So I'm going to just pick up some things that we tend to feel very comfortable about when we talk about humans, and see how they might fit with animals. Buckle up. So here we go. So we're quite happy talking about humans as having a vocation.
Yes.
Do animals have a vocation?
I think they might. And I think there are examples in the biblical witness where you do see animals that appear to be fulfilling a vocation, like Balthasar, who clearly is able to communicate with humans and to see divine presences. So that's part of the theological imagination that has informed the shaping of Scripture. And I think there's also the wonderful passages in Job, which talks in great detail about the lives of different creatures, wild creatures often, which suggests that the author was deeply attentive to the animals around him. So again, that's part of the biblical narrative.
And in fact, God plays with Behemoth and
Yes.
What's the other monster? I've forgotten now.
Leviathan.
Leviathan. Yeah. Can animals praise God? Do they have that kind of intentional relationship that humans could with God?
I think I think the Bible talks about the whole of creation praising God just by fulfilling their purposes. So I think it might be possible to talk about vocation in terms of creatures, probably particularly creatures like dogs that are in relationship with human beings.
I was reading Gerard Manley Hopkins as Kingfishers Catch Fire recently. I don't know if anybody knows that, in which the poet, a Jesuit, late 19th, early 20th century poet, talks about animals being themselves without having to think about it. And the way that they are themselves is a glorifying to God. Contrasts it with the way in which we humans kind of trip ourselves up quite a bit, because we second guess ourselves, don't we?
Yes.
Can a dog sin?
Sin.
Sin. You know, humans sin.
Yes. One of our previous border collies.
This is telling tales now,
Yes.
isn't it?
Was a lovely dog. We had 2 dogs at the same time, a border collie and a German shepherd. The German shepherd knew that she shouldn't do things. The collie knew that she shouldn't do things when she was being watched. So you would catch her doing things that were very, very naughty. And yeah, if you appeared, she would stop. So I caught her once. I was watching through the crack in the door. She was in the kitchen, and there was I think it was a tart pushed to the back of the work surface. And she had got one paw on the work surface, and the other, she was reaching over, bending over to try and hook it to the front so she could eat it. Now, the German Shepherd was bigger, would have been able to reach it much more easily, but it would never have occurred for her to do that.
Do animals in any sense need salvation?
I think it talks about the whole of creation yearning for the salvation of God, so I would say yes. Not from sin necessarily, but
Okay.
Mm.
And if that's so, and if we're, I mean, I guess a lot of us are there'll be a number of vegetarians or vegans in the room. There'll be a fair number of us who are involved with campaigning.
Mhm.
What might yeah, you can all look at each other. What might, if this is a sort of gradually dawning realization that Christianity is not about souls encased in flesh and we can ignore everything else, but actually about ecosystems.
Yeah.
What implication might that be for the church?
I think the church is beginning to take more seriously its call to be stewards of creation and to see that in a caring rather than the idea of dominion, which has dominated Christianity for far too long. I think originally the biblical image of stewardship was much more pastoral, so the shepherd king image. But I think it also has implications on the relationships with animals that we're in connection with, but also the wider biodiversity in the wider systems that we need to be much more mindful of as being of infinite value to God.
Let's pause. I'm going to give you a chance if you want to grab a drink, go to the loo. I'm going to give you some questions in the break. So here are 3 questions which I've asked Fiona if she supply. First of all, could you think about animals that you know, and what do you understand to be their emotional states? So animals that you know and their emotional states, what insights do you already have? Question 1. Do you read? Because
My handwriting is very bad. Christian teaching presumes life in the age to come as being in the new heaven and the new earth. What part might animals play in this?
Lastly,
if animals are part of God's plan for the redemption of all things, what implications does this have for the way in which we order our lives with animals now?
So emotional stuff about animals you know, future stuff, animals in the new heaven and the new earth, and then the ethical question, how should we treat them? Let's take a break for 10 minutes. So we'll reconvene at, in 10 minutes, so 7:36, 7:37. Those of you who are on Zoom, please do put your questions in the chat and we'll have those read out. But if we could just say an intermediate thank you to Fiona.